My name is Michael Fitzpatrick and I'm a GP in Hackney in London, and I'm over here in New York to talk on the therapy culture. Well, I think we've seen over the last few years a number of surveys which have purported to estimate the prevalence of various sorts of mental illness at rates much greater than were ever thought of in the past, and the prevalence of depression and anxiety and other disorders at rates of 1 in 4 have been widely promoted. And I think it's clear that if that is the sort of estimate that's being put forward, that we're talking about something different from our previous traditional understanding of mental illness. And what seems to be happening is that a widening range of experiences of adversity or loss or setbacks in life seem to be interpreted under the rubric of mental illness. I think that's what's happening, rather than there being any sudden increase in actual what would have previously been understood as mental illness. Well, I think the culture that we've seen coming into existence over the last few years is one in which, on the one hand, governments have taken it upon themselves to intervene much more in what you might describe as personal life, the individual selfhood of citizens. In a way, they've retreated from the involvement in political and economic affairs and moved more towards interfering in people's personal lives. And one of the areas that's had an effect in is in all sorts of areas of so-called therapy, in the education sector, in workplace, in society more broadly. The other side of the equation is that I think people have been much more ready to accept an interpretation of their problems in terms of mental illness than they were in the past, and therefore to accept therapeutic intervention and indeed to seek therapeutic intervention. And so a whole new relationship has come into existence between the individual and the state, which is no longer in terms of the relationship between a citizen and government, but more the relationship between a therapist and a client. And I think that's a very significant shift that's happened in recent years, and that defines the therapeutic culture. Well, I think that no doubt therapists are motivated by a desire to help people, and people consult therapists in a desire to deal with their problems. I think what we're talking about here, though, is something somewhat different from that. It's a wider cultural phenomenon where, over a very short period of time, people who would not previously have understood their problems in mental illness terms or sought help with them in mental illness terms are now doing so, and that's what's new. On a scale, in a very short period of time, on a scale vastly greater than they ever did in the past. So that's the new phenomenon. And I think you can't understand that purely in terms of any conventional understanding of mental illness. It's the redefinition of the scope of mental illness. I think the implications of it are that if you've got a new relationship between the citizen and the state in terms of where the citizen sees himself as somebody who is vulnerable and in need of support and in need of nurturing and counselling and therapeutic intervention, or indeed pharmacological intervention, then the idea of the self-determining individual, the idea of the autonomous citizen, which is the basic of our democracy, the person who holds himself to account and has a sense of individual responsibility for his behaviour, and also holds government to account in similar terms, that no longer exists. We've now got a very different conception of a weak and vulnerable and feeble individual who can no longer play that role in society. The individual who needs support and nurturing almost before he can get out of bed in the morning.